People often say funerals are for the living. They are meant to offer a bridge of closure for those left behind, a quiet space to process the unbearable weight of absence. But over the years, I've come to realize something much darker. Sometimes, a memorial isn't a bridge at all. It is simply a stage where the living finally drop the mask of feigned filial piety they have worn for decades. The house was incredibly still that Saturday morning. I sat in the dim light of our living room, the curtains drawn, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the silver pocket watch in my vest. Sarah had given it to me on our 10th anniversary. I have carried it every single day since. Right then, every tick felt like a hammer striking an anvil, marking the time I had left before I had to finally say goodbye. On the solid oak coffee table in front of me sat a heavy brass urn. It caught the faint rays of morning light squeezing through the blinds. 25 years of shared coffee, whispered conversations, and quiet walks among the roses, all reduced to the ashes resting inside that cold metal. For 40 years, I stood in front of high school chalkboards as Mr. Thorne, teaching teenagers about history. I taught them how empires crumbled, how treaties were broken, and how wars were usually started over pride, territory, or a dangerous mix of both. I retired a few years ago, trading my red grading pens for pruning shears in the backyard rose garden. I thought my days of studying conflict were over. I never imagined that the most vicious battle I would ever face wouldn't be in a textbook, but in my own family, over the memory of the woman I loved. Sarah was a woman who found profound joy in the simple things. She didn't care for luxury. She loved the smell of rain on dry pavement, the vibrant bloom of a well-tended climbing rose, and the modest, comforting echo of the choir at St. Jude's, our local church. When she passed away, after a brief but brutal illness, the only thing that kept me standing was the determination to honor her the exact way she had lived, with quiet grace. But grace was a foreign concept to Derek. When I married Sarah, her son was 10 years old. Even then, he was a child who calculated the value of his surroundings. I spent 25 years doing my absolute best to be a father to him. I paid his college tuition. I sat in the bleachers at his games. I clapped loudest at his graduation. But as Derek grew into a 35-year-old corporate executive, he began measuring a person's worth by the labels on their suit and the balance in their portfolio. To him, my side of the family, the teachers, the mechanics, the nurses, who had embraced Sarah as a sister and a mother figure, were nothing more than blue-collar embarrassments. The tension had been brewing all week during the arrangements. Derek had flown into town, pacing around my living room in his tailored suit, constantly checking his phone. When I told him the memorial would be held at St. Jude's, he actually scoffed. I remember the exact look on his face. He pinched the bridge of his nose and let out a long, exasperated breath. He complained that the church smelled like musty hymnals and old carpet. He insisted we needed a proper venue because his biological father's side of the family was flying in, along with several senior partners from his firm. They expected a certain standard, he argued, and he absolutely refused to host them in a place that lacked prestige. I remember looking at him, a boy I had helped raise, feeling a profound sadness. I reminded him that his mother loved St. Jude's. We were not hosting a corporate networking gala. We were laying his mother to rest. He didn't argue further. He just gave me a tight, unreadable smile, muttered something about making some calls, and walked out the front door. I assumed he had accepted reality. That was my first mistake. Now, it was Saturday morning. I adjusted my black tie in the hallway mirror, feeling the phantom weight of Sarah's hands, smoothing the collar, just as she had done 1,000 times before. My sister and my nieces had flown in over 2,000 miles from across the country. They were already at the church, waiting to help arrange the modest floral pieces we had ordered. I walked back into the living room and carefully picked up the brass urn. The metal was heavy, solid, grounding me in the reality of the day. I walked out the front door, locking it behind me, and stepped into the crisp morning air. I was ready to give my wife the peaceful, dignified farewell she deserved. What I didn't know yet was that Derek had already taken it upon himself to rewrite the script of our final goodbye. The drive to St. Jude's took exactly 14 minutes. I had made that same drive every Sunday for over 2 decades with Sarah in the passenger seat. This morning, the passenger seat held only the heavy brass urn, carefully secured by the seatbelt. It was a clear, unseasonably warm Saturday. The dashboard clock clicked to 9 a.m. right as I pulled into the small gravel parking lot of the church. St. Jude's was a modest brick building that had stood at the corner of Elm and Maple since the late 40s. It didn't have a sprawling, manicured campus or towering stained glass imported from Europe. It had creaky oak pews, a slightly out-of-tune organ, and a congregation that felt more like an extended family. It was exactly the kind of place Sarah loved, a sanctuary that offered quiet comfort rather than loud spectacle. But as I parked the car and stepped out, the air felt entirely wrong. Funerals have a distinct rhythm to them. A subtle hum of arriving vehicles, the soft murmurs of early guests, the discreet shuffling of directors coordinating the flow of the morning. Today, there was nothing but the rustle of dry leaves scraping across the empty asphalt. Standing by the front steps was my younger sister, Eleanor, clutching her coat against the autumn chill, flanked by my 2 nieces. They had flown in from Oregon the night before, a grueling 2,000-mile journey, just to say goodbye to the woman who had knitted their baby blankets. As I approached them, urn in hand, I noticed Eleanor's eyes were wide with a profound confusion. "Henry," she said, her voice wavering slightly, "the doors are locked, and I don't see the florists. Weren't they supposed to deliver the white lilies at 8? I looked past her to the heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary, closed, padlocked from the inside. There were no white lilies gracing the entrance, no welcoming ushers holding programs, no organist warming up with a soft hymn. The deep emptiness of the scene struck me before the actual reality did. Just then, the side door of the rectory swung open. Pastor Thomas stepped out into the sunlight. Thomas was 65, a man who had shared countless Sunday dinners with Sarah and me. He was usually a picture of serene confidence, a steady anchor for his parish. But right now, his shoulders were slumped. He was wiping his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief and looked thoroughly exhausted. "Henry," he said, walking briskly toward us. He glanced at the urn in my hands, then at Eleanor. His expression caught somewhere between deep sorrow and intense discomfort. "I am so incredibly sorry. I've been trying to reach you for the last hour, but your phone went straight to voicemail." I instinctively touched my pocket. I had silenced it during my morning reflection at the house. "What is going on, Thomas?" I asked. I could feel the cold brass of the urn pressing through my coat against my ribs. "Why is the church locked?" Thomas let out a heavy sigh, folding his handkerchief with nervous hands. "It's Derek. He called the parish office late last night, well past 9 o'clock. He told the secretary that there had been a sudden change in plans. He said he was the sole primary family member coordinating the arrangements, and that the service here was officially canceled." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I felt a sudden, sharp stillness settle over me. "He canceled his mother's memorial. He didn't just cancel our venue," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a sympathetic murmur. "He called the local florist and the organist, too. Told them their services were no longer required. He claimed it was an executive decision made by the estate. Because he used the term estate and sounded so authoritative, the vendors complied without checking with me. When I found out this morning, I tried to reverse it, but the florists had already repurposed the arrangements for another event, and the organist took a job out of town. It takes a certain kind of audacity to weaponize a funeral. Throughout my years teaching history, I noted how the denial of proper burial rites was often used as a final crushing insult to a defeated enemy. But this wasn't a battlefield, and Derek wasn't a conquering general. He was a boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose first tie I had knotted before his middle school dance. To hear that he had invoked the word estate to strong-arm local vendors behind my back, it was a calculated strike, designed to isolate and humiliate. I looked at my sister. The fatigue of a cross-country flight and the fresh grief of losing her sister-in-law were visibly breaking her down. Tears began to well in her eyes. My nieces stood frozen on the steps, unsure of what to do or where to look. A history teacher learns early on that panic is highly contagious. The moment you lose your composure is the moment you lose control of the room. I took a slow, deliberate breath letting the crisp morning air fill my lungs, forcing my heart rate to remain steady. "Eleanor," I said, placing a firm, reassuring hand on her shoulder, "take the girls and sit on the stone benches in the memorial garden back there. The sun is out. Just give me a moment." She nodded silently, wiping a tear from her cheek, and led my nieces away from the heavy locked doors. I turned away from the church steps and pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen showed 3 missed calls from Thomas. I cleared the notifications, opened my contacts, and dialed Derek's number. The phone rang exactly once. Then, the mechanical voice of the voicemail system kicked in. He had manually sent me to voicemail. I ended the call and dialed again. Same result. I dialed a third time. 1 ring. Voicemail. He was screening my calls. He knew exactly where I was, what time it was, and the profound humiliation he had just inflicted on my family. He had left us standing in an empty parking lot on the day we were supposed to bury my wife. I stood there in the quiet, the heavy brass urn cradled against my chest, calculating the implications of what a 35-year-old corporate executive thought he could get away with. I was just about to ask Pastor Thomas if we could use his private office to figure out our next steps. Then, at exactly 9:15 a.m., my phone buzzed in my palm. A text message had just come through. It was from Derek. The screen of my phone was difficult to read in the bright morning sunlight, so I turned slightly, using my own shadow to block the glare. I tapped the notification. It was a single, unbroken paragraph. No greeting, no apology for the locked church doors. Just cold, administrative cruelty delivered in plain text. It read, "Moved it to the Oak Ridge Country Club. Better catering, better crowd. Just for Sarah's real family and my clients. You're not real blood, Henry. Keep your side of the family away, it's embarrassing." I stared at the glowing letters. "You're not real blood." I read it twice. Then a third time, analyzing the syntax the way I used to grade a poorly constructed history essay. There was a staggering amount of betrayal packed into those 35 words. 25 years of fatherhood, dissolved in an instant by a man wearing a suit I had likely paid for during his college years. When I married Sarah, her first husband, Derek's biological father, was a man who believed fatherhood could be outsourced through quarterly checks and an occasional postcard from a ski resort. It was I who sat up with Derek when he had a fever of 103. It was I who taught him how to drive a manual transmission in empty parking lots, who bailed him out when he made foolish teenage mistakes, who held his shoulder in silence when his first girlfriend broke his heart. I had chosen to love him as my own. But right now, he didn't need a father, he needed a stage. Oak Ridge Country Club was a glass and steel monument to new money, a place where people paid exorbitant membership fees just to ensure they didn't have to associate with anyone outside their tax bracket. It was entirely devoid of character, warmth, or history. It was the absolute last place on earth Sarah would have ever wanted to be remembered. She hated pretension. She used to say that any place requiring a dress code for its dining room was a place that didn't know how to actually enjoy a meal. Derek was hijacking her memorial to impress his firm's senior partners and the wealthy biological father who had suddenly reappeared to attend the event. And to ensure his networking gala went smoothly, he was cutting out the very people who had loved his mother the most. Because our bank accounts and professions didn't match the country club's aesthetic, we were deemed embarrassing. I looked over at the church's memorial garden. Eleanor was sitting on a stone bench, wiping her eyes with a crumpled tissue, while my nieces sat closely beside her, leaning their heads on her shoulders. They had traveled 2,000 miles. They had spent their own hard-earned savings on last-minute flights, purely out of love. They were the ones who had called Sarah every Sunday evening just to check in. They were the family she had chosen. I had watched men twice my size lose everything because they allowed anger to dictate their actions. They would yell, they would curse, they would make threats they couldn't enforce. I wasn't about to make that mistake. A long career in teaching history shows you that the most effective response to a sudden betrayal isn't a loud explosion. It's a quiet, structural dismantling of your opponent's supply lines. The profound sorrow I had felt all morning didn't disappear, but it crystallized. It turned into a block of absolute freezing clarity. Derek had unilaterally decided to erase my family from my wife's final farewell. By typing the words "not real blood" He had fundamentally severed our contract of family. He had set the rules of engagement. Pause here for a second. If you've ever poured your heart, your time, and your soul into a blended family, only to have someone try to invalidate your love over a lack of shared DNA, drop a comment below. Share your story. Let the algorithm know that family is built on presence, not just biology, and hit subscribe if you want to see exactly how I handled this. Because, as I stood there in the church parking lot, looking down at the heavy brass urn resting safely in the crook of my arm, a very simple, undeniable geographic fact occurred to me. Derek had successfully secured the Oak Ridge Country Club, the high-end catering, and the wealthy crowd. But I had the guest of honor, and I wasn't going anywhere. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The silence of the morning felt different now, not like a void, but like the deep breath before a strategic maneuver. I turned back to Pastor Thomas, who was watching me with a mixture of concern and pastoral patience. "Thomas," I said, my tone perfectly even. "Derek has moved the service to the Oak Ridge Country Club. He specifically requested that my family not attend." Thomas's eyes widened, a flash of genuine anger crossing his usually gentle features. "Henry, that is. I don't even have the words. What can I do?" "I need a favor," I replied, gesturing toward the back of the property. Sarah loved the rose garden behind the rectory. We spent a lot of Sunday afternoons sitting by that old oak tree. I would like to borrow it for the next 2 hours. Just for Eleanor, the girls, and me. We don't need music. We just need the space. Thomas didn't hesitate. "The garden is yours, Henry. For as long as you need. I'll bring out some folding chairs and a small table for the urn." As Thomas hurried off, I looked down at the brass vessel in my hands. The metal was warming against my skin in the morning sun. Derek viewed his mother's remains as the centerpiece for his high society performance, a necessary prop to legitimize the gathering of his firm's partners and his biological father's wealthy friends. He needed the urn to make the networking event look like a memorial. Without it, he was just a man hosting a very expensive, very morbid cocktail hour. And speaking of expensive, memory is a powerful tool, especially when you are accustomed to keeping track of dates, treaties, and financial clauses. Earlier that week, when Derek had first complained about St. Jude's, he had offered to handle some of the peripheral logistics. He asked for my premium credit card, claiming he needed to finalize the deposits for the casket transport and the original caterers we had planned to use at the church hall. I had handed it over without a second thought, trusting him completely. Oak Ridge Country Club was notorious for its strict billing policies. I knew this because a former colleague of mine had hosted a retirement dinner there. They require a card on file to secure the reservation, but the final staggering bill is charged at the conclusion of the event. For a last-minute premium catering package for an elite crowd, the cost would easily eclipse $18,000. Derek didn't have that kind of liquid capital. His lifestyle was heavily leveraged on luxury car leases and downtown apartment rent. He was relying on my line of credit to finance his charade, likely planning to ask for forgiveness rather than permission once the charge went through. He had used my money to fund a party I was banned from attending, simply because my blood wasn't blue enough. I walked slowly toward the memorial garden, the gravel crunching under my dress shoes. I found a quiet wooden bench beneath the shade of the oak tree, set the brass urn gently on my lap, and pulled my phone back out. I didn't call Derek. I didn't send a furious text message demanding an explanation. I simply opened my bank's mobile application. A long-standing principle of siege warfare is that you never attack the fortress directly if you can simply cut off the supply lines. Derek had built his fortress at Oak Ridge. He had locked the gates and manned the walls, but he had left the supply line entirely in my hands. I navigated to the credit card management section. There was a pending authorization from Oak Ridge Country Club for a nominal holding fee, confirming my suspicion. I tapped the transaction. The screen offered a few options. I selected the option to report unauthorized use. The prompt asked if I wanted to freeze the card immediately to prevent further charges. I tapped confirm. A small green checkmark appeared. The digital drawbridge was raised. The account was locked, impenetrable, and flagged for security review. When the country club's management tried to run the final $18,000 bill at the end of Derek's elite gathering, the terminal would decline it. Hard. I slipped the phone away and pulled the silver pocket watch from my vest. It was 9:45 a.m. The event at Oak Ridge was scheduled to begin at 11. By noon, the guests would be expecting a eulogy over an urn that wasn't there. By 1:45, the catering manager would be presenting a bill that couldn't be paid. Thomas appeared from the rectory carrying 3 wooden folding chairs, his face a picture of quiet solidarity. Eleanor and the girls walked over from the other side of the garden, their faces soft with grief but ready to say goodbye. I stood up, holding my wife safely against my chest, ready to give her the beautiful quiet mourning she deserved. The trap was set, entirely legally, entirely silently. All I had to do now was wait for the walls of Oak Ridge to crumble. The morning in the rose garden was exactly what Sarah would have wanted. There were no microphones, no catered appetizers, no forced networking. Just the rustle of autumn leaves and the soft, genuine weeping of people who had truly known her. Pastor Thomas stood near the old oak tree, reading a passage from Psalms, his voice carrying the gentle rhythm of a man who had comforted thousands of grieving souls. Eleanor stood beside the small wooden table, her hand resting delicately on the cold metal of the brass urn. It was intimate. It was real. We shared stories about Sarah's terrible habit of burning Sunday roasts, her infectious laugh, and the way she could make any stray cat in the neighborhood feel like royalty. For 2 hours, the garden was a sanctuary of memory, entirely insulated from the cruel ambition of the world outside. But the world outside was operating on a very different schedule. At exactly 11:30, the silver pocket watch in my vest ticked steadily against my chest, and my phone began to vibrate in my coat pocket. It was a violent, sustained buzzing. I stepped away from the small gathering, walking toward the stone wall at the edge of the property, and looked at the screen. Derek's name flashed in bright, demanding letters. I let it ring a few times, letting the autumn breeze cool my face, before finally pressing answer and bringing the phone to my ear. "Where are you?" Derek's voice was a frantic, hushed hiss. It was the sound of a man standing in a crowded room trying desperately not to let anyone hear him panic. "Henry, the service started 20 minutes ago. My father is sitting in the front row. The senior partners are looking at their watches. Where is the urn? You were supposed to be here an hour ago with the urn." I looked back at the small table under the oak tree. The sunlight was hitting the brass, making it shine brilliantly against the backdrop of red roses. "I am exactly where I need to be, Derek," I said, my words paced and deliberate, much like the cadence I used when explaining the fall of empires to my students. "I am at St. Jude's, with your mother's real family." "Are you insane?" he spat, his breath hitching. "You can't do this. I have 50 of the most important people in my industry sitting in the Oak Ridge Grand Ballroom, staring at an empty mahogany podium. You are making me look like a fool. Bring her here right now." "I'm afraid I can't do that," I replied calmly. "You made it exceptionally clear in your text message. We are not real blood. Our presence would be an embarrassment to your high society guests. I am simply respecting the boundary you drew." There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as the reality of his situation set in. He had an audience. He had the expensive venue, but the star of the show was 2 towns away, safely guarded by the man he had tried to discard. But the humiliation of an empty podium was only the first half of the lesson. "Henry, please." Derek's voice shifted from angry to desperate. The aggressive corporate executive was gone, replaced by a panicked debtor. "Listen, something is wrong with your card. The catering manager just pulled me out of the ballroom. They tried to pre-authorize the final billing to ensure the funds were there before they roll out the main course. It declined. They're saying the card is frozen. You need to call your bank immediately. The bill is over $18,000, Henry. They are threatening to stop the food service right now if I don't give them a working card." I leaned against the cool stone wall of the churchyard. Through the phone, I could hear the faint, elegant hum of a string quartet playing in the background at the country club, completely oblivious to the financial crisis unfolding near the kitchen doors. Derek was sweating in his tailored suit, surrounded by people who measured worth in dollars, and he had just run out of both. I did call my bank, Derek. I stated quietly, about 2 hours ago. I reported unauthorized activity. Unauthorized? He choked out. Henry, it's for my mother's memorial. No, I corrected him. It's for a networking event at a venue I was explicitly uninvited from. You chose to host a private party. You chose the guest list. And you chose to handle the logistics. I am simply stepping out of your way. I don't have $18,000 liquid right now. He nearly screamed, the facade completely cracking. They are going to call the police for theft of services. You can't do this to me. I watched Eleanor place a single white rose next to the urn. The contrast was striking, profound peace before me, and absolute destruction through the earpiece. Blood might give you the right to call her mother Derek, I said, letting every syllable land with absolute finality. But kindness and a marriage certificate gave me the right to own that bank account. Pay for your own party. I tapped the red button, ending the call, and powered the phone off completely. The silence that followed was beautiful. I later learned the full extent of the disaster at the Oak Ridge Country Club through a mutual acquaintance who had the misfortune of being in the room. When the catering manager realized the $18,000 bill wasn't going to be cleared, they halted the food service entirely. Waiters physically removed plates of untouched hors d'oeuvres from the tables. Derek was forced to stand in front of his firm's senior partners, his wealthy biological father, and 50 confused guests, and admit that not only had he misplaced his mother's remains, but he also couldn't afford the very event he had invited them to. His biological father, utterly mortified by the public spectacle, refused to bail him out, and simply walked out of the ballroom. Derek's carefully cultivated reputation as a successful high-status executive vanished in the span of 30 minutes. But the final chapter of this lesson was written by Sarah herself, 3 days after the memorial in the Rose Garden. We sat in the polished conference room of our family lawyer's office. Derek sat across the mahogany table from me, his eyes bloodshot, his posture rigid with a mixture of exhaustion and lingering entitlement. He was banking on his inheritance. He assumed that, as her only biological son, he was owed a substantial payout from her estate, money he desperately needed now to cover the massive debt he had incurred from the venue, as the country club was threatening immediate legal action. The lawyer cleared his throat and opened the folder. Sarah was a deeply observant woman. She had watched Derek's slow descent into materialistic vanity over the years, and her will reflected her quiet wisdom. The document was brief and legally ironclad. She left the entirety of her estate, the house, the savings, and the investments, solely to me. There was a secondary clause, however. It stated that as the sole executor, I had the discretionary power to allocate a specific financial trust to Derek, but only if I deemed he had maintained the integrity and values of our family. Derek leaned forward, a greedy anticipation momentarily replacing his scowl. He looked at me, expecting me to fulfill my usual role, the quiet, accommodating stepfather who always fixed his mistakes and paid his debts. Instead, I reached into my briefcase and placed a heavy leather-bound photo album on the table. I pushed it across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of him. "This is your mother's collection of your childhood photos," I said, my voice steady and resonant in the quiet room. "Every birthday, every graduation, every holiday. It is the only thing she valued that I believe you are entitled to." "What about the trust?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "The money, the funds from that trust," I replied, standing up and buttoning my coat, "have already been fully disbursed as a charitable donation to the local children's hospital in Sarah's name. They needed the funds to build a new family wing. Real families, Derek, the kind that actually show up for each other." He sat there in stunned, absolute silence, staring at the closed cover of the photo album. He had traded 25 years of genuine unconditional love for a fleeting moment of social leverage, and in the end, he was left with absolutely nothing but pictures of a past he had chosen to betray. It has been a few months since that morning in the lawyer's office. The autumn chill has given way to a gentle, quiet winter. I spend my mornings in the backyard, sitting on the wooden bench overlooking the dormant rose bushes. I hold a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea in one hand, feeling its warmth seep into my fingers. Next to me, resting on a newly constructed modest marble pedestal, is the heavy brass urn. The sunlight catches it perfectly, just before noon. There is no audience here. No forced networking. No expensive catering. No desperate need to impress people who do not matter. There is only the profound, enduring peace of a promise kept. Family isn't defined by the blood we share, but by whether we are willing to bleed for one another. Those who only seek to extract value from the people around them will ultimately find themselves entirely empty-handed. I want to ask you something before you go. How do you define the word family in your own life? Have you ever had to protect the memory of someone you loved from someone who shared their DNA? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you value the kind of loyalty that isn't dictated by a birth certificate, consider subscribing. I'll be here, sharing more stories from a life quietly lived.